Bethel Synagogue is home to the Hebrew congregation of Newfoundland and Labrador. The structure was built in 1960, but the province's Jewish community dates back centuries. The earliest known Jewish residents were living on the island of Newfoundland by the 1790s. At the time, thousands of immigrants were traveling to Newfoundland and Labrador from southwest England. Among them were Jewish settlers. Just how many, though, cannot be known because documents from that time are scant and inconsistent. Nonetheless, a few names did make it into printed records. One was Peter Ezekiel, who was living at Harbor, Maine by the year 1794. Another was Simon Solomon. A watchmaker and jeweler by trade, he arrived at St. John's in 1792 and set up shop on Water Street. By 1805, he had also become the colony of Newfoundland's first postmaster. Today, Solomon's Lane in downtown St. John's is a lasting tribute to his impact. Between 1880 and 1920, more than 2 million Jews emigrated out of Eastern Europe. Most left a portion of the Russian Empire known as the Pale of Settlement. It included either large parts or the whole of modern-day Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, and Moldova, as well as small parts of Latvia and Western Russia. The immigrants left to escape anti-Semitic violence and oppressive laws that intensified after the assassination of Tsar Alexander II in 1881. The government falsely blamed his death on a Jewish conspiracy and launched a brutal wave of state-sponsored massacres known as pogroms. Most Jews fled to the United States, but some settled in other areas, including the island of Newfoundland. There, many found work in trade and commerce. The island's small garment industry benefited greatly from Jewish business people. For example, in 1895, Joseph, Benjamin, and Moses Myers opened the Newfoundland Clothing Company in downtown St. John's. As business boomed, its staff swelled from about 25 employees in 1898 to 145 by 1916. By 1901, Joseph Bernstein had opened a firm on Water Street for women's clothes. A few decades later, he moved to Windsor and opened a tailor shop there. Other Jewish-owned businesses in the garment industry included the Premier Garment Company, Rosenberg and Company, the Model Shop, and London, New York, and Paris. Many new immigrants also found work as traveling salespeople in the early 1900s. Known as peddlers, they visited small communities with items not available in local shops. By traveling around the island, the newcomers learned about the land and its people and gained a greater understanding of the English language, including the many Newfoundland dialects. The work also allowed some peddlers to accumulate enough capital to eventually open permanent shops. One of the earliest belonged to Israel Perlin. He was a Russian Jew from Poland who moved to New York before settling at Newfoundland in 1891. Initially a peddler of dry goods in Fortune and Placentia Bays, Perlin opened a wholesale and retail shop on Water Street in St. John's in 1893 with his brother Frank. By 1905, I.F. Perlin and Company was employing a network of Jewish salespeople in the outports. Many peddlers who worked for Perlin later opened their own shops. One was David Feeder. In 1906, he emigrated from Lithuania to North America and ultimately settled in St. John's. After working a spell for Perlin, Feeder opened a dry goods shop on Water Street. In 1914, he married Sadie Goldstone. Her parents had fled Eastern Europe in the 1890s and settled on Belle Island. Sadie's brothers later opened the London, New York, and Paris clothing store on Water Street in St. John's. In addition to helping Feeder and other immigrants, Israel Perlin made a lasting contribution to the Jewish community in 1909 when he helped found the Hebrew Congregation of Newfoundland. Services were initially held at 170 Water Street, but later moved to various rented spaces in downtown St. John's. A permanent home was found in 1931 when a synagogue was built on Henry Street. 30 years later, the synagogue moved into its current home on Elizabeth Avenue. Although most Jews settled in St. John's in the early 1900s, smaller numbers were dispersed across the island. Official immigration statistics are scant from that period, but Jewish-owned shops were operating at places like Belle Island, Stephenville, Corner Brook, Twillingate, Badger, Grand Falls, Windsor, and Burin. The small and scattered nature of Jewish settlement created some difficulties. Most communities did not have a Jewish population large enough to support a rabbi, nor could they form a minyan. That's a quorum of 10 adult men needed to conduct official services. Access to kosher food was another problem. And in the first half of the 20th century, Newfoundland's increasingly strict immigration policies created significant challenges. Even as immigrants were demonstrably enriching Newfoundland and Labrador's society, culture, and economy in the early 1900s, the government introduced a string of new legislation designed to limit entry. In 1906, it passed an Aliens Act, which subjected all non-British immigrants to financial checks and medical tests. Canada and America passed similar legislation at around the same time. The discriminatory restrictions were designed to solicit immigrants from Great Britain and Western Europe while deterring those from other places. The government tightened controls even further in 1926 when it passed an Immigration Act in June, followed by additional regulations in November. Among other things, the new rules gave the government discretionary powers to deny entry to anyone it deemed, quote, unsuited to the climate or requirements of the colony or of immigrants of any specified class, occupation, or character, end quote. Historian Gerhard Basler was an expert in Newfoundland and Labrador's pre-Confederation immigration policy. He found that even as the Third Reich rose to power in the 1930s, the Dominion remained virtually sealed off from Jews seeking sanctuary. Basler estimated that about 12,000 were denied entry into Newfoundland and Labrador. He wrote, "To Central European refugees, Newfoundland from 1934 to 1941 appeared to be a country that, like Canada, cared little and did less. No humanitarian considerations entered the picture, as the admission of refugees was viewed solely from the vantage point of their immediate and specific economic usefulness." Basler noted that Newfoundland's dire financial situation impeded its ability to accept refugees. After almost going bankrupt in 1933, the elected government was replaced by one appointed by Britain. Known as the Commission of Government, it had far fewer resources than countries like Canada and America to accommodate refugees. Even so, the Commission was in a position to do far more than it did. The accommodation of 12,000 refugees would undoubtedly have been a Herculean task and responsibility that the Commission might have been unable to undertake. But a smaller number, Finance Commissioner John Penson suggested 1,000 families, would have been manageable. Having come close to bankruptcy in 1933, furthermore, Newfoundland was understandably preoccupied with its own survival during this critical period. Yet the evidence is clear, and was so to leading government officials at the time, that the European refugee crisis of the 1930s was rife with significant opportunities for Newfoundland's recovery and development. These officials rejected every opportunity, and their decisions were based on no compelling reasons. Thousands of individual and family applications were turned down, even those from first-degree relatives of Newfoundlanders. Among them was a man who wanted to escape from Poland with his wife and 2 children. He wrote a letter to government officials in 1938. "My one plea to you is this, to grant my family and me permission to obtain papers or whatever may be necessary that we may go to Newfoundland, where I now have a sister married in Corner Brook, Newfoundland, and my sister could do a lot to help me and my family." The Commission of Government turned down his request. It also rejected applications from large groups who proposed business ventures that might have aided Newfoundland's struggling economy. Among them was a petition from a Budapest lawyer who wrote on behalf of 1,000 highly educated and skilled Jewish farming families from Hungary. They offered to bring farm equipment and other assets into the Dominion to establish an agricultural enterprise. The Commission rejected the request, claiming that there was not enough land. A few months earlier, an editorial in the Daily News had called upon the government to do almost precisely what the lawyer had proposed. Does all the world contain no land areas upon which refugees may be settled to work out their own salvation as pioneer communities? Some such tracts there must be. Labrador might even be one of them. The sentiments were echoed 2 weeks later in an anonymous letter to the editor. It also suggested that refugees could help the Dominion's struggling healthcare sector. It is not often that Newfoundland is able to assist others. We think we have so little to offer. But we have the blessing of freedom, and that at the present time is something to be greatly prized by one class of persecuted people. And we need doctors badly. Basler wrote that of the approximately 12,000 Jews who sought entry to Newfoundland and Labrador, only a dozen were admitted. Most were nurses and doctors who were hired to work in rural areas. The Commission of Government maintained its tight grip on immigration controls after the war ended in 1945, but it did begin to admit Holocaust survivors in 1946. In her book Salt, Fish, and Schmatas, A History of the Jews in Newfoundland and Labrador from 1770, Robin McGraw estimated that there were at least 26 families of Holocaust survivors on the island after the war. Among them were Andreas and Betty Barbin. They arrived at St. John's in 1947 with their young son Gregory. Andreas was a classical musician who helped grow the discipline in St. John's. Among other things, he helped found the Newfoundland Symphony Orchestra, and he taught music at Memorial University. Today, the institution offers a music scholarship in his name. Philip Reitman also moved to St. John's after the war. Sent to Auschwitz in 1942, he lost his parents and 7 siblings to Nazi violence. Reitman moved to St. John's in 1946 to be with an aunt. He later wrote about his experiences. Newfoundland will always be a very special place that helped me survive my heavy emotional burden. People did not know my life story. They only found out later. To this day, I cannot forget all the kind-heartedness shown to me by the Newfoundlanders. I feel as if all of them are my brothers and sisters. It is with them that I rediscovered the goodness in human beings. Louis and Grunia Furman also found sanctuary on the island. After surviving the Holocaust as resistance fighters, the pair moved to St. John's in 1947. The newspaper Observer's Weekly described their story for St. John's readers. Escape from the ghetto in Poland, 6 years of underground fighting as partisans in Poland, a trek through Europe ending up in a displaced persons camp in Rome, Italy, and finally to be rescued by a cousin whom they had never before seen in their lives is the epic story of Mr. and Mrs. Louis Furman, who arrived here from Rome by Trans World Airlines to their cousin, Mr. M. Sheffman. They are the only ones remaining of a large family of relatives of Mr. Sheffman who all met tragic deaths at the hands of the Nazi monsters. In the 1970s, the Furmans initiated a Holocaust memorial service at Bethel Synagogue in St. John's. Now an annual service, it is attended by more than 300 people every year. After Newfoundland and Labrador joined Canada in 1949, it finally abolished the old immigration policies and began to actively solicit newcomers. It is estimated that Newfoundland and Labrador is today home to about 500 Jews. They live in towns throughout the province, but St. John's remains the center of the Jewish community. There, the Hebrew Congregation of Newfoundland and Labrador continues to hold regular services at the Beth El Synagogue. More recently, a Chabad Center opened in 2017. Chabad is the largest Jewish organization in the world with a presence in over 100 countries and territories.